We have in the F-14, as well as any laser guidance pod, so whether you get the F-18 in the future, or the F-16, or the A-10, or whatever it might be, lasers on pods work through laser codes. Do you understand that part of the way it works?
Um, no.
Okay, so let's say that we are, flying in a force ship of F-14s and we're trying to drop bombs to destroy airplanes on an airfield. Though that's a lot of laser guided bombs in a tight proximity, right? Being an airfield. And so, how do we prevent my bomb from tracking, say, my wingman's laser and therefore having two bombs hit his target and no bombs hitting my target? Well, the way that that is prevented is what's called a laser code. And in the F-14, when you're doing up your loadout, on the right-hand side here, when you choose your weapons, you want to make sure, of course, you've got some laser-guided bombs, you've got your targeting pod on the aircraft, and then if we go to the three little dots on the furthest right-hand side of the aircraft menu, when you click on your aircraft, we get all the way down here, we've got laser code first, second, third, and fourth digit. So this is a code that the laser, instead of being a continuous like laser beam, like shining a flashlight at something, it's actually, think of it more like a strobe light. It's actually flashing very, very quickly on the target. And the sequence of flashing, like say the interval, almost think of it as like a Morse code, is what the laser guided bomb is looking for and then locks onto. So in aircraft like the F-14 or F-16, the ground crew actually come out to the bomb and stick a screwdriver into the bomb and then twist it to set a laser code for that bomb. We then have to make sure that our laser code that our targeting pod is going to be lasing onto the target matches that of our bombs. In more smart aircraft like the FA-18, you can actually change the laser code of your bombs on the fly. So just to kind of have this as part of the demonstration as well, we'll go ahead and change our laser code here to 1576, and I'll show you how to change the laser code with Gesture. So that way you can see that as well. So this is going to be our aircraft, and we'll go ahead and fly the mission. Because it makes sense, right? It's like if you got a whole flight of airplanes going to drop some laser guided bombs, you got to make sure that they're all going to track the correct laser. And this is true also of, say, laser guided weapons on helicopters, on ground vehicles, all these kinds of things.
Okay, so let's say we have a ground unit. Let's say a Humvee with a laser. He can output the same code that is set to your bomb.
Yep.
Wow. Okay.
Yes. Cool. Yeah. So a little bit different from that. The way it works is we have essentially we have the bombs on our aircraft, and especially in aircraft that aren't smart and have a digital architecture like an FA-18. So on our F-14, we've got our bombs set to our code that is discrete to our aircraft. And then we would basically tell the guy on the ground in the Humvee with the self-flam, we would say, hey, this is the code on our bombs. Make sure you're lasing that code. Otherwise, my bombs aren't going to track your laser. And so that's part of a whole sequence of radio calls that a guy on the ground, usually called a JTAC, needs to express with the guy in the aircraft in order to ensure that everything is set absolutely perfectly for that bomb to hit the target. And it's called a 9-line. And it's a, like I said, a very specific sequence of radio calls and even a kneeboard card for the guy on the ground, as well as the guy in the aircraft, to make sure everybody's on the same page. So that way, if the bomb misses short or it misses long, the bomb is not going to accidentally hit friendly troops on the ground or civilians. Make sure the laser code is good to go. Make sure the ground area is not too densely populated. Make sure that the the pilot knows about any obstructions in the area, like say large buildings or tall mountains, all these kinds of things to make sure that the attack is going to go off correctly, because obviously dropping a 500-pound bomb, is not something to take lightly. That's for sure.
Yeah.
So we'll go ahead and start flying here. One thing that also can lead to some frustration is clouds, right? So with a laser guidance pod or a targeting pod, we need to make sure that we are in VFR conditions, which we are, but these clouds are definitely going to make it a little bit more challenging for us.
Yeah.
So we'll go ahead and get ourselves an autopilot. That way we can be a little bit more hands-off. Using the autopilot in the F-14 is pretty darn easy. And it's something that can make your job a whole lot easier with trying to keep the aircraft nice and stable while trying to drop laser-guided bombs. So in order to get Jester to start using the targeting pod, we need to go to the air-to-ground mode for the HUD with this little button down here.
Okay.
And once the mode has initialized on the HUD, we can hear that Jester just told us that the laser is armed. I know that you can't hear Jester at the moment, and that's totally fine. That doesn't really matter too much for our lesson here. We're then going to open up the Jester menu, and we'll select our actual air-to-ground ordnance that we want to drop, which is pretty easy for us because we've got 4 of all the same weapons.
Okay.
Does the Lantern pod have different zoom or camera modes?
Yeah, so it does have 3 zoom steps that the Rio can actuate from the back seat, and so we can. Jester seems to do it automatically. There's no way for us to tell him how to zoom it in or not, which I wish that there was a way to do that, but unfortunately that's not coded into the sim at the moment. But he will automatically adjust the zoom to whatever he feels is the right place for it.
Okay.
Yep, so we'll go ahead and have him kind of start to use the pod at this point. First things first is we need to open up our kneeboard with right shift and K, and we can see our laser code on the first page here is 1576. So we need to tell Jester to implement the correct laser code. And we're about to fly over our target here, so we'll just kind of enter a nice lazy orbit as we get everything set up. Biggest thing with using laser guided bombs is don't be impatient. Just be very, very patient with the whole process. So we'll go to next page, and then we'll go to set laser code. So the first digit is always a 1, so we got 1 5 and then 7.
Roger that.
All right, so now we have 1576 inputted for our laser code. And down on our lantern display here, we can see that our weapon currently selected is a GBU-12, and the laser code with the little A in front of it is 1576, which matches our laser code right here on our kneeboard. So we can go ahead and close our kneeboard, and we can start asking Jester to track targets. So there's a couple different modes that we have here. We know that our current target is going to be at waypoint 2. We're going to attack some vehicles and some aircraft on the ramp at the international airport here at Damascus. So first thing we want to do is we want to go to Q mode. Q is where we're queuing the pod to. So we've got a couple different options here. We've got Q HUD, Q snow, Q waypoint, and Q map marker. So what that means is Q HUD means that the pod is going to be centered right on our HUD here, right in the dot inside of our water line on our HUD. Q snow is going to mean that it is going to go into snowplow mode, which the pod will look about 45 degrees down below the nose, so it'll be kind of scanning down in this area. At the moment, I believe it's currently in Q... it's in Q HUD, which we can see down here. So we can see the pod is currently in air-to-ground mode, and it's currently in Q HUD mode.
Okay.
So for today, what we want to do is we want to go to Q mode, Q waypoint, Q waypoint 2. So we know that our target is going to be at waypoint 2, which is going to be Damascus International Airport. And it's going to be a little challenging because of all these clouds. So we might have to drop down to an unrealistically low level here to actually get some good drops on our target, but that's all right. And so we can see, we can't see anything in our pod right now, which is what we just talked about with the masking lines. We can see this little dot over here. It's telling us where around our aircraft the pod is looking, as well as it's outside of the masking lines, which is why the pod is masked. The pod is currently looking into our right-hand engine intake from the right-hand glove station, or the right-hand engine nacelle is probably a better way to describe that. So because this little dot is right here, almost at our 9 o'clock position, that means that the target that it's currently looking at is at our 9 o'clock right out here, which is evidenced by the fact that we can see Damascus International Airport right over here. So with that, we'll go ahead and drop down and we'll fly towards the target area. And we'll drop underneath these clouds. Kind of unrealistic to be this low, but it's my mistake for having these low clouds in the mission.
What would you recommend in terms of altitude? Talking like, let's say, what would be the Tomcat's optimal altitude for, let's say, launching a Phoenix or dropping a GBU?
So dropping laser guided bombs, there's no real altitude limit. It's best to be high. The reason for that is that when you're dropping laser guided bombs, obviously you're dropping them on bad guys and they want to kill you before you kill them. So they're going to be shooting at you from the ground. And the higher you are, the less guns on the ground can reach you, right? Because they have to fight gravity and all that. So only the biggest AAA guns will be able to reach you up at, say, 20,000 feet or 25,000 feet, or even maybe 30,000 feet if you want to go for it that way. Another thing is a limiting factor is going to be weather, right? So if the clouds are low, we need to get underneath the clouds because we need to be in VMC in order to be able to see our target over here through our targeting pod. If a cloud or smoke or any of that stuff gets in between us and the laser, the bomb is going to lose track of the laser because the laser is not going to be able to penetrate those clouds or that smoke, just in the same way that light can't penetrate clouds or smoke. So think of your laser as like a flashlight that you're shining at the target. For air-to-air missile engagements, the higher you are when you fire your missiles, the better. Because, there's this whole thing called missile kinematics that you can read about in very minute detail online. But essentially, air density, the lower you are, the higher the air density. The higher you are, the lower the air density. And so if a missile has to push through less air, it can travel farther on its finite energy resource, which is its motor. So the higher you are, the further your missile will travel. But keep in mind that works in both directions, right? So the guy who's shooting back at you can shoot back at you from a longer distance if you're up high as compared to down low. So that's why in lots of YouTube videos, you'll see pilots when they get missiles shot at them, specifically SAMs for sure, they duck down to a lower altitude because then that missile has to push through more air and therefore expend more of its energy trying to get to you. And you can run it out of energy and it'll just fall out of the sky harmlessly without hitting you. Complex, a little bit of a complex answer to a simple question, but in aviation, everything's a complex answer to a simple question. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
So looking at the symbology for our targeting pod, we've got this line up here on our view through the targeting pod. This line is our azimuth steering line. And then there's a little tick mark over here that shows us where our target is in terms of azimuth. And so it's showing it way off to the right-hand side, which is true because there's our target right over there. We can see it. So at this point, we are going to be flying in a right-hand orbit around the target because of the fact that our pod lives right here. We don't want to mask its view of the target through our fuselage here. If we were flying in a left-hand orbit around the target, we might mask our pod, and that would, negate us to be able to find targets. So in our field of view of our pod here, the resolution of the Lantern pod isn't awesome to begin with, and then the resolution of the screens in the F-14 Tomcat is even worse than the targeting pod itself. So that's why things are very grainy and hard to make out. But looking at this, we can kind of pick out certain things. We can see the 2 fires at Damascus International Airport that we can see, where is it? Right out here. So that's a good sign. We know we're looking in the right spot. And so we can see kind of a long, kind of bright area right here, which makes me think that that's going to be an aircraft on the ramp. We can see what looks like some runways and taxiways out here, which matches the description of what Damascus International Airport looks like. So we know we're definitely looking in the right spot. Now we just have to get Jester to put the crosshairs on that enemy aircraft over there. Jester can do multiple things in terms of finding targets. He's not very good at finding static targets like these aircraft on the ramp here at Damascus International, but he's better at finding active targets that have an AI associated with them, such as, AAA guns, SAM launchers, tanks, trucks that are moving, things like that. Something to keep in mind, though, is Jester has a really hard time finding stuff if you're too far away, and he'll just keep on searching until you get closer and closer enough for him to actually find something. We can see right here, this is the range to where the crosshairs are currently pointing, 18.6 nautical miles. I would say that when you have Jester search for targets, you want to be at least 10 nautical miles away from them, because if you're further than about 10 nautical miles, he's not going to be able to actually find anything in the pod. So we'll go ahead and we will execute a bombing run on one of the aircraft on the ramp out there at Damascus International. So we'll go ahead and unpause. We're going to sweep the wings into bomb mode. About 55 degrees of wing sweep, and that's going to give us the most accurate weapon drop that we can get. And we'll start to slow the aircraft down as well. There's no reason to be flying super, super fast while we're doing this. Oh, it looks like we're going to get into some clouds, so we'll duck underneath these clouds. Okay, so now we'll go ahead and use the HUD mode, or sorry, the head tracking mode to be able to bring Jester down to that aircraft that we saw on the ramp. So we'll go head control, direct head control.
To area track.
So for direct head control, when we look around with my head tracking software, we can see a red dot in the middle. If we bring that red dot inside of this red circle, we are then going to be controlling the lantern pod with our head. Now, this is obviously not the way it works in the real aircraft, but what it's trying to simulate is, talking through the intercom system to the Rio in the back seat and going, hey, dude, can you move the pod a little to the right, little to the right, little to the right, a little up, little up, little up, little to the right, that kind of situation, which it kind of mimics that kind of idea pretty darn well, in my opinion. So we'll go ahead and unpause again. And we'll start to move the pod this way a little bit. And it looks like that was actually a building, so we'll have him move the pod a little bit more. Kind of looking, oh, there's some aircraft, that's for sure. So we'll have him move the pod right over the top of one of these candids on the ramp here. Right there. And now at this point, this is kind of the harder point right here. We have the crosshairs over the target area, and modern targeting pods, like say a lantern pod or a sniper pod that are on more modern aircraft, do a really, really good job of keeping their crosshairs on the target through gyroscopes and things of that nature. The lantern pod, and especially here on the F-14, has a really difficult time with keeping its crosshairs in the same spot as we maneuver the aircraft around. So we have to tell Jester to mark this point on the ground as a target. And the way we do that is we go through the menus and tell him to designate that point on the ground. And so what that's going to do is he's going to squirt a little bit of laser energy by squeezing on his trigger in the back seat. And that way we can get a good laser range finding solution on where the crosshairs are. It will then develop coordinates for that point, and then it will be locked onto that target and keep that target underneath the crosshairs. So, it's all this really complex stuff happening in the background, but once you get really good at it, you can do it very, very quickly and efficiently. So we'll go ahead and get him to queue up that target. And next page. Designate.
We're in laser range. Come right, come right.
Cool. So at this point, Jester has designated that target, right? And now he's going to also be talking us onto the target audibly. He's going to say, hey, come to the right, come to the right, come to the right, come to the left, come to the left, that kind of stuff. And we can now get a vertical bar on the right-hand side of our feed from the targeting pod. This is going to be our drop queue. So this little marker at the top of the line, as we get closer to it, is going to start falling down this line. And that's kind of our timing device. And when this line here matches up between these two dashed lines down here, that's when we drop the bomb. We also have a countdown timer. It says TREL. That means time to release is 55 seconds. 55 is the maximum time count it'll do, and because we're not even flying towards the target, that's why it says 55. This little line up here, we should have matched underneath the caret up top for our azimuth steering to the target. And so that way we can get the bomb onto target as accurately as possible. We can see that we are looking directly at the side of almost directly at the side of those aircraft on the ramp down there. And if we zoom in really far here, we can see those aircraft down there on the ramp. So like I said earlier, it's kind of like flying two airplanes at the same time. That's a lot of what it is. You're kind of thinking about where the pod is pointing, where the target is, keeping track of the target, and then steering your aircraft around towards the target area. So with that in mind, we'll go ahead and execute the actual attack run. All right, so we'll go ahead and come right. When you're using the lantern pod, you want to try to avoid super tight high G turns as much as possible, because that can throw the pod off from where it's looking. And we can hear Jester in the background telling us to come right more and more and more. And when you're up at a higher altitude, it also gives you a better view of the target, or sorry, it gives you more time to get the target nice and lined up. And we can see Jester had a hard time keeping the targeting pod lined up on the target, even as we're maneuvering here relatively gently.
Right, 20 degrees.
Now he's saying more to the right, about 20 degrees. That makes sense. All right. So at this point, we can see on the feed from our lantern pod, we see this line is starting to come in towards the center. This line, our drop line, is coming down towards here, and that's our release queue. So like I said, it's going to travel down this line, and we've got a time to release of 21 seconds. So we have 21 seconds to get our azimuth steering perfect, as well as make sure that we're going to drop our weapon on time here. We've got our crosshairs nice and centered up on that IL-76 down there. when you're using a targeting pod, you want to try to have the crosshairs pointed at the very base of the target, because it's actually pointing at the ground, not at the target. So if we have the crosshairs pointing directly at, say, the middle of the fuselage, the weapon's going to actually impact beyond the target. So we want to make sure it's right at the base there, which is perfect for right now. I know I'm going fast, so if you need me to stop and answer any question, just let me know.
Yeah, I think I get most of this. I was just gonna say, after the air to ground, I now have a couple of questions about the BR, but
Okay.
that's not important for now.
Okay, well, we'll just fly through this, and then we'll answer any more questions that you got. So, getting it lined up. All right, getting nice and lined up azimuth-wise. There we go. There we go, we're nice and lined up. Beautiful. And weapon release. And now all we gotta do is just keep our aircraft nice and steady while Jester does the rest for us. He's gonna start lasing the target when there's 10 seconds left to impact.
10 seconds TTI.
Alright, we know that the laser is shining when the L on the bottom of the screen starts flashing. 4 seconds to impact.
Impact.
And there it is. We got him.
Terminate. Terminate.
And Jester's going to stop squeezing his trigger, so now the laser is no longer firing. And we are good. That is a successful attack run on that IL-76. Now, one thing we can do here is see how the targeting pod is now walking away from the target as it's getting closer and closer to getting masked, is we can tell Jester to cue the pod to our designated point, which is currently that destroyed IL-76, which makes it much easier for a re-attack on the same location. So let's go ahead and do that now. We'll go Q mode, Q des. Whoop, what happened here? Okay, cool, it did it. I accidentally double-clicked the button. So now we can see the pod is just totally masked, it's totally black, it's looking inside of itself, because we're flying away from the target area. So, if we turn 90 degrees to the right-hand side, we will unmask our pod and be able to re-enter that right-hand orbit around the target area and start searching for targets again. There we go. Now we're unmasked, and we're ready to rock and roll, and maybe potentially drop bombs on these other aircraft that are on the ramp down there. Any questions about what we just did here at all, or any of it confusing or anything like that?
No, you explained pretty well. I get it now. It's
Awesome.
very, very cool.
Yeah, it is really, really cool. And honestly, I think the way that Heapler actually modeled this, I think that even though we're kind of doing weird things in terms of trying to make it work for a simulator, I think it models how a Rio and a pilot work together to actually drop a weapon onto the target pretty darn well. So it's very, very cool. But anyway, so that'll be the end of that lesson, and now we can talk about some BVR stuff.